The air was thick with tension, the kind that only comes when power and pride collide. In the narrow alleyway behind a Harlem nightclub, Bumpy Johnson found himself surrounded. The evening sky, heavy with the weight of unspoken promises and threats, was darkening, but it was the harsh streetlights casting long shadows that told the real story. Luciano's men were closing in, their guns drawn, their fingers twitching on the triggers. The moment was one of those still, frozen beats in time. The kind of moment when you could hear the faint sound of a man's heartbeat, the muffled shuffle of leather shoes on pavement, the scratch of a cigarette being flicked to the ground. The kind of moment that would either mark the end of an era or define it. Bumpy Johnson stood tall, unflinching, his dark eyes scanning the men who had come to do more than just threaten him. They were here to remind him who controlled this territory. They were here to make him submit, to remind him who called the shots in Harlem. But there was something in his posture, in his calmness, that made the air crackle. It was a stillness that felt like the calm before the storm. "Put down the guns, boys." Bumpy's voice was steady, his tone carrying the weight of authority. The men paused. This wasn't the reaction they expected. They were used to intimidating the smaller players, bending them into submission. They expected Bumpy to fold, to be scared, maybe even to beg. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't anyone's fool. He knew the game they were playing, and he knew exactly how to play it back. The guns were still aimed at him, but something in Bumpy's eyes told them they might have miscalculated. A thin smile crept across his lips, a smile that said, "You don't know who you're dealing with." The tension built, as though time itself was taking a breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. But it didn't come. Instead, a single unexpected move from Bumpy left them all stunned. Bumpy Johnson wasn't born into power, but he knew how to earn it. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, he had been raised in a world where survival meant more than simply existing. Harlem was where he found his feet, where his name became synonymous with control, respect, and most of all, fearlessness. By the time he reached his prime, Bumpy had cemented his place as one of the most influential figures in Harlem's criminal underworld. He wasn't just a street boss. He was a force. The people respected him not because of his ruthlessness alone, but because of his intelligence, his ability to navigate the shifting tides of Harlem's power structure. He understood the law of the streets, but he also understood the law of the elites. He was a bridge between two worlds, street-level crime and organized syndicates. And he used that connection to rise above them all. But Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a symbol, the pulse of Black America in the early 20th century. A haven of culture, art, and defiance against the oppressive forces of racism. Bumpy wasn't just a man who ruled a street corner. He ruled Harlem itself. His influence extended into every corner, from the numbers rackets and the casinos to the political machines and the police force. He'd done business with mobsters, politicians, and even cops. His reputation wasn't just built on fear, it was built on respect. That respect was the reason he wasn't fazed when Lucky Luciano's men raised their guns. He didn't feel fear because he had earned the kind of respect that made people think twice before pulling a trigger. He knew his worth in Harlem, and anyone who underestimated him was in for a rude awakening. Yet, it wasn't just his reputation that had brought him to this standoff. No. It was something more personal, something that cut deeper than money, power, or respect. The mob had tried to take what was his, tried to intimidate him, break him, and Bumpy Johnson wasn't the kind of man who could be broken. The sound of boots tapping on the pavement interrupted the standoff. A car slowly rolled by, its headlights casting long shadows over the figures standing in the alley. Bumpy stood his ground, eyes never leaving the men who held the guns. But he wasn't just looking at them, he was weighing them, calculating the next move. And he knew exactly how to play this hand. The city was still alive, even in the dead of night. Harlem's streets always had a pulse, bright, sharp, ever vibrant. But tonight, the pulse felt different. It was tense, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Luciano's men weren't just any street thugs. They were seasoned professionals, mobsters hardened by years of navigating the most dangerous underworld in the world. The mob was everywhere, covert, always lurking, manipulating. They controlled the vice and the wealth, running their business from the shadows of a city that worshipped them. But Harlem had always been different. Harlem was Bumpy's turf. He'd fought hard to carve his name into the streets, and no man, no matter how powerful, could just stroll in and take it from him. This wasn't just about turf. It was about pride, about not letting anyone forget who ruled this place. The legend of Bumpy Johnson wasn't one to be taken lightly. His adversaries weren't the kind of men to show mercy. Luciano's influence was already making waves in the city, and his men, dressed in sharp suits, their faces expressionless, had come to make a statement. They thought Bumpy would back down, maybe give in to their threats. But this wasn't some corner street dispute. This was the heart of Harlem. This was Bumpy's kingdom. The men raised their guns. Bumpy didn't flinch. His calm was almost unnerving, his broad chest puffed out in defiance, his eyes fixed on the barrels of the guns that had been aimed squarely at him. The mob's men were trying to intimidate him, to show him that they had the upper hand. But they couldn't understand the gravity of what they were facing. "Think you can threaten me, huh?" Bumpy's voice broke the tension in the air, low but thick with authority. "You think pulling those guns is gonna make me flinch?" He took a step forward, closing the distance. There was no backing down in his stance, no sign of fear in his gaze. His reputation was built on this very moment, the refusal to be cowed, to ever let his pride be trampled on by anyone, even the most feared syndicate in the country. But it wasn't just bravado. It was an understanding of power. He knew these men didn't just want a fight, they wanted submission. Luciano's men, eyes narrowing, started to shift their weight. One hand still on the trigger, the other twitching nervously. They could feel the pressure. They could sense that Bumpy wasn't your average man. This wasn't the first time the mob had flexed its muscles in Harlem, but this was the first time someone like Bumpy Johnson was standing in their way. "Lower those guns," Bumpy said again, each word heavier than the last, his gaze unwavering. One of the men, dressed in an impeccable black suit, smirked, the first sign of arrogance. "You must be out of your mind, old man. You don't get to tell us what to do." He gestured to his crew. "Show him what happens when people forget their place." But the man's words hung in the air like smoke, fading before they could settle. Bumpy wasn't backing down. For a brief second, the scene was frozen. No one moved. Not even the cars passing by seemed to make a sound. Then Bumpy did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket, The men flinched, their eyes darting to his every move, wondering if he was pulling out a weapon, if this was the moment they'd be forced to pull the trigger. But Bumpy's hand didn't go for a gun. Instead, he pulled out something even more unexpected, a cigar. He took a slow, deliberate puff, the smoke curling up into the night air. The men, still pointing their guns, were left in stunned silence. What was he doing? Did he think they wouldn't shoot? But Bumpy's nonchalance was the key. By lighting that cigar and puffing on it calmly, by doing something so mundane in the face of an immediate threat, he threw them off their game. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't afraid. And that, in itself, was a power move. His response wasn't the one they expected. They were waiting for fear. They were waiting for him to fold under the weight of their intimidation. Instead, they were met with a defiant silence, and it shook them more than any loud confrontation could. "You're out of your depth," Bumpy finally said, exhaling the cigar smoke into the cold Harlem night. "Now, lower your guns. This ain't your neighborhood. You've got one chance to walk out of here alive." The words were spoken with such calm authority that it sent a chill through the men. Titasi could see in his eyes that Bumpy wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a fight for dominance. This was about respect, and Bumpy Johnson wasn't about to let anyone disrespect him on his own turf. For a moment, the men exchanged glances. The leader, the one who had spoken first, glanced nervously at his crew, realizing the weight of what was happening. His grip on his gun loosened slightly. He didn't want to back down, not in front of his crew, not in front of a man like Bumpy. But he could see the calculating look in Bumpy's eyes, the certainty. This wasn't just a power move. It was a command, and Bumpy's command was not one to be ignored. The leader took a slow step back, then another. Then the rest of the crew followed suit, unsure of what they had just witnessed, but too cautious to defy it. Bumpy took another puff from his cigar, nodding in satisfaction. The moment of confrontation passed. The power had shifted in an instant. The mobsters had expected a battle. Instead, they got something far more dangerous. A man who knew exactly how to make them back down without firing a single shot. As the mobsters lowered their guns, the tension that had gripped the street didn't dissipate immediately. Bumpy Johnson stood there, the smoke from his cigar still swirling around him, his presence imposing, yet calm. He could feel the weight of their stares, the disbelief that had taken root in their eyes. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him to remain unfazed, not in the face of such an obvious threat. It was clear now. They had underestimated him, and that was the mistake they wouldn't be able to undo. The silence hung in the air like a fog, but it was the kind of silence that had weight, a heavy kind of quiet that spoke volumes. No one dared speak. The mobsters, still processing what had just happened, shifted uneasily. They had come here to send a message, to force Bumpy into submission. Instead, the message was clear. Harlem wasn't a place where power was just handed over. You had to take it, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed. Bumpy took another draw from his cigar, and the action sent another shiver through the crew of Luciano's men. This wasn't just a quiet retreat. It was a subtle victory. A victory built not on firepower, but on the kind of quiet authority that men like Bumpy Johnson exuded. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice. His reputation spoke for him, and tonight, that reputation had worked in his favor. The mob boss's men were now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. They were in his world now. The streets they thought they could control were his streets, and Bumpy wasn't going to let anyone walk in and claim them without earning his respect first. Not even men as feared as the Luciano crew. "You've made your point," Bumpy said, his voice low and steady. "But don't mistake this for weakness. I'll say it again. Lower your guns." His words were simple, yet they held the kind of weight that could crush men. Bumpy wasn't making a suggestion. He was giving an order, one that demanded immediate compliance. The leader of Luciano's crew, who had been the first to speak, was now visibly shaking, the grip on his gun slipping even further. He had expected to intimidate Bumpy, to make him cower, but the opposite had happened. And now, in this moment, they were all too aware of how small they had become in Bumpy's presence. For a brief moment, the leader looked as if he might attempt to reassert control, but something in Bumpy's unwavering gaze made him hesitate. It wasn't just the unflinching calmness. It was the quiet understanding that Bumpy wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. The mobster was caught in the trap of his own arrogance. He had miscalculated, and in that split second, Bumpy saw the moment of indecision in his eyes. That was when Bumpy did the unthinkable. With a quick movement, Bumpy stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the mob leader. The action was so sudden, so swift, that the crew had no time to react. The barrel of a gun might have been pointed at him, but Bumpy wasn't intimidated. Instead, he walked right into the line of fire, his gaze locked with the mobsters. "Take your best shot," Bumpy said coldly. His voice didn't waver. "Go on, see what happens next." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, time itself seemed to stand still. No one moved. The streetlights flickered above. The only sound was the occasional rustle of the wind. The tension was unbearable. The gunman's fingers twitched on the trigger, but something stopped him. It wasn't fear. It was uncertainty. The leader of Luciano's men, a man who had spent years commanding respect through violence, found himself facing something he couldn't intimidate. A man who commanded respect through silence, through presence, through an unwavering belief in its own power. Bumpy wasn't just defying them physically. He was challenging everything they thought they knew about power. He wasn't afraid to die, but he wasn't going to die on his knees. He was going to make them understand that they couldn't make him a victim, not without consequences. His confidence wasn't arrogance. It was the unshakable knowledge that he had earned his place and that no one could take it from him. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Every muscle in the mob leader's body was tense, his mind racing for an escape, a reason to pull the trigger, but he couldn't find it. He wasn't just facing a man with a gun. He was facing a man who was unafraid of death, a man who had already conquered what it meant to survive in the streets. Finally, the leader's hand dropped, his gun lowering slowly. His crew followed suit, one by one. The tension that had held them all in place slowly began to unravel, but not without a deep, unsettling sense that something had shifted. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reminder. Bumpy didn't need to shoot a single bullet. He had already won. And as the mobsters slowly backed off, their eyes filled with an unspoken respect, the power dynamics had changed irrevocably. The crew turned and walked away, their heads down, defeated not by force, but by something far more powerful. Bumpy Johnson's unyielding presence. And as they disappeared into the shadows, Bumpy stood tall in the street, his cigar still lit, knowing that the legend he had built was now etched into the very fabric of Harlem. The street was still, save for the faint sound of the retreating footsteps of Luciano's crew. Bumpy Johnson remained rooted in place, his expression unreadable as the weight of the moment lingered in the air. His men, who had been standing in the background, now slowly stepped forward, their eyes locked on their leader. The tension that had been so thick just moments ago had been replaced with a silent, palpable respect. Bumpy took a final puff of his cigar, flicking the ash into the cold night air. The faint orange glow of the ember illuminated his face, casting shadows over his sharp features. He exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on the spot where the mobsters had stood. He had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for the whole of Harlem. This wasn't a personal victory. It was a statement, a reminder of the power he had earned through blood, sweat, and years of struggle in the unforgiving streets. One of his men, a younger associate who had been close to Bumpy's side throughout the years, took a few cautious steps toward him. He had seen his boss in many situations, during heated deals, tense encounters with the law, and moments when violence seemed inevitable, but never quite like this. "Boss," the man began, his voice almost a whisper, "You all right?" Bumpy didn't answer right away. His eyes were still focused on the distance where the mobsters had disappeared. Finally, he turned toward his associate, his face hardening, but there was something more beneath the surface, a quiet, measured wisdom. "I'm fine," Bumpy said, his voice low but firm, "but they won't forget this. No one forgets the man who stands his ground." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The truth was in the air. They hadn't just encountered the mob. They'd encountered the legend of Harlem itself, a man whose resolve couldn't be broken by threats, bullets, or intimidation. The men around Bumpy exchanged glances. They knew the implications of what had just transpired. The Luciano crew would be back. They had no choice. But it wouldn't be the same. There was a shift in the power dynamic now, one that would echo through Harlem for years to come. Word would spread fast. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man to be pushed around, not by anyone, not even the most powerful mobsters in the city. As they walked away from the confrontation, the streets seemed quieter than usual, almost reverent. The atmosphere had changed, and for the first time in a long while, the legends of Harlem walked with a renewed sense of pride and security. The immediate aftermath was nothing short of dramatic. The news of what had happened spread like wildfire through the underworld. Harlem's streets buzzed with the story, how Bumpy Johnson had faced down Luciano's men without flinching, how he had stood alone in the street while they raised their guns, and how, in the end, they were the ones who backed down. The confrontation had all the ingredients of a legendary tale: power, defiance, and a single, quiet act of resolve that would come to define the streets of Harlem. But Bumpy didn't bask in the glory of the moment. There was no time for celebrations. He knew that the Luciano crew would regroup, replan, and return. It was only a matter of time before the mob made another move. But Bumpy had made his point clear, and it wasn't just about the mob. It was about respect. That night, as Bumpy walked through the darkened streets of Harlem, he felt the eyes of the community upon him. No one said anything directly, but he could feel the unspoken recognition, the kind of respect that came from knowing a man had done what many thought was impossible. He had just reminded the mob and anyone who thought they could intimidate him that Harlem was his, and no one could simply take it from him. His territory, his people, his honor. Bumpy had earned them all, and no amount of firepower or threats would change that. The following days brought a ripple of quiet anticipation through Harlem. As the word of the showdown with Luciano's men spread, something else spread with it. Respect. The streets hummed with whispers of the man who had stood tall against the mob, without flinching, without hesitation. There was a new aura around Bumpy Johnson. It wasn't the typical bravado of the streets, the kind that came from a fast-talking hustler or a street thug looking to make a name for himself. No, Bumpy had something deeper. He had earned his place in the underworld not by force, but by the strength of his resolve and the respect he commanded. The consequences of that fateful night were far-reaching. For the first time in a long time, the mob felt uncertainty in Harlem. Luciano's men, seasoned veterans of the criminal game, had been forced to retreat. The message was clear. Harlem was not a place where power could simply be taken by force. It had to be earned, and Bumpy Johnson had earned it. And not just through deals or influence, but by the willingness to stand up, to defy even the most dangerous men, and walk away unscathed. In the days that followed, the respect Bumpy garnered became undeniable. His phone never stopped ringing. Men came to him with offers, deals to be struck, territories to be discussed, and businesses to be built. But the best offers were the ones that simply acknowledged his power. No one tried to push him around anymore. His authority was no longer questioned. It was understood. The mob had learned the hard way that Bumpy Johnson was not a man to be threatened, not a man to be manipulated. And it was a lesson that would continue to echo throughout the streets for years to come. Even lucky Luciano, a man who had made a name for himself by running one of the most powerful crime syndicates in the world, had to recognize the weight of Bumpy's defiance. Luciano was many things, ruthless, cunning, and driven by ambition. But he was not blind. He knew the risk that came with pushing Bumpy Johnson too far, especially now. In his own way, even Luciano had to respect the courage Bumpy had shown. But it wasn't just about the mob. The real impact was felt in the community. The people of Harlem, who had long struggled under the weight of the system, now had a figurehead, a man who didn't just talk the talk, but walked the walk. Bumpy had always been known for his leadership, his ability to inspire, but now it was clear that he was a symbol, not just of power, but of resilience, of standing up to forces much bigger than oneself and prevailing. The shift in Harlem was subtle at first. Business as usual continued, the storefronts still bustled, the clubs still pulsed with music, and the street corners still had their share of action. But there was something different in the air. People walked with their heads held a little higher. There was a sense of pride in the streets, a quiet understanding that Harlem had its own protector, its own defender. Bumpy's influence grew, but not just because of fear. It was because of the genuine respect he commanded from those around him. He had never been one to flaunt his power, but now it was clear that his reputation preceded him. The name Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a name. It was a legacy, a symbol of defiance, a symbol of what it meant to stand your ground in the face of adversity and come out stronger on the other side. As the weeks passed, there was one thing Bumpy knew for sure. This confrontation was not just a fleeting moment in his career. It had solidified something deep within the fabric of Harlem's criminal underworld, something that couldn't be erased. The mob, the law, and even the most ambitious of hustlers knew that Bumpy Johnson had not just earned his place in Harlem. He had built it, brick by brick, on his own terms. Bumpy was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was with purpose. His quiet demeanor was often misinterpreted as indifference, but those who knew him best understood it was something far more powerful. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to make threats to prove his strength. He was the kind of man who could silence a room with a single look, command respect with a single move. And now, the entire world knew it. The message that had been sent that fateful night wasn't just for Luciano's men. It was for anyone who thought they could walk into Harlem and try to take what was his. No one could take Harlem from Bumpy Johnson, not without a fight. And if that fight meant facing down the most feared men in the mob with nothing more than his own resolve, then that was a fight Bumpy was ready for. In the days following the showdown, the streets of Harlem were buzzing with a new kind of energy. It was a quiet energy, subtle yet undeniable. The respect Bumpy Johnson had earned that night was not fleeting. It was cemented in the very fabric of the community. People saw Bumpy not as just a man, but as a symbol of resilience, a representation of what it meant to stand firm in the face of impossible odds. To those who lived and breathed in Harlem, Bumpy was more than just a figurehead in the criminal world. He was the embodiment of the unbreakable spirit that defined their community. The people of Harlem had always been caught between two worlds, the law and the street, the oppressed and the oppressor. But with Bumpy Johnson, they had found someone who stood at the intersection of those worlds and made sure the balance tipped in their favor. He was their protector, their leader, and now he was more than just a man. They saw him as a living legend. The world around Bumpy did not change overnight, but it shifted. He had always been a man of principle, a man who demanded respect. What had changed was how the world now saw him. Where once his authority might have been questioned, now it was an undeniable fact. His actions against Luciano's men had sent a message to the streets, to the underworld, and to the community. No one could walk over Bumpy Johnson without facing the consequences. He wasn't someone to be dismissed. Not anymore. But it wasn't just the criminals and the law enforcement who were affected by the shift in power. Harlem itself had changed. The streets that had once been divided by fear and distrust now hummed with a collective sense of pride. The people who had watched Bumpy stand his ground in the face of danger now felt a sense of security that had been long missing from their lives. They saw him as their defender, not just against the mob, but against the injustices that plagued their world. And in that moment, Bumpy wasn't just a part of their world. He had become their world. Bumpy's response to the guns of Luciano's men wasn't just a calculated move in a street battle. It was a declaration of power and defiance. His ability to remain calm, collected, and unyielding in the face of a life or death situation was the true mark of his legendary status. It wasn't the act of standing down the mob that made him a legend. It was the way he had done it, with dignity, with respect, and with a clarity of purpose that the world couldn't ignore. In the years that followed, Bumpy Johnson's influence continued to grow, not just in the underworld, but in the heart of Harlem itself. His name became synonymous with power, but also with justice. He was no longer just a name whispered in the streets or a face that appeared in the shadows of backroom deals. He was a force, and he wasn't going anywhere. His legacy was now intertwined with the very soul of Harlem. And as time went on, it became clear that no one would dare challenge his rule again, because anyone who tried would soon learn what had made Bumpy Johnson a legend. Through the years, as Bumpy walked the streets of Harlem, his eyes often fell on the faces of the people who had come to see him as a protector. The older generation saw him as a symbol of what had been fought for, while the younger generation saw him as the blueprint for their own futures. Bumpy had walked through fire, survived, and emerged stronger, and in doing so, he had ensured that Harlem would never again be ruled by fear, by violence, or by men who thought they could take what belonged to the people. The lesson was clear. Respect in the world of Bumpy Johnson was not given, it was earned. And once earned, it was unshakable. As the years passed, the story of that fateful night would be told over and over again, becoming part of Harlem's folklore. It wasn't just a tale of survival, it was a testament to the strength of one man's character and the power of standing up to those who believed they could push others around. It was a reminder that no matter how big the challenge, no matter how dangerous the odds, there was always room for one more legend. For Bumpy Johnson, the world would come to understand he was more than just a man. He was a legacy, and his story would never be forgotten. His actions that night weren't just about winning a confrontation. They were about winning the right to be respected, and in doing so, changing the course of history. This wasn't just about one man's pride. This wasn't about a simple fight for power. This was about something deeper, about standing up for the community, for those who had long been marginalized and silenced. Bumpy Johnson's defiance was a spark that would light the way for generations to come, teaching them that respect is not something you can demand, but something you must earn. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world what respect truly means.